Firstly, as the Renaissance had such a far-reaching effect, both socially, economically and politically, through the following centuries up until the 20th century, I think it important to give a good background of the history that accompanied the flourishing art and science during this enlightened time. We are generally led to believe after a period of time called the Middle Ages, quite suddenly, Europe came out of an almighty fog. It had for sure been through a most testing few hundred years after the decline of the Roman Empire, with wars, crusades, east-west schisms in the wake of this, the Roman Church hanging on to a bare thread of Christianity during plague and death, to name but a few. And at last, as things appeared to get better, all to be brought into sharp focus again during the 1500s with the moral high ground of the Northern Lutherans and their declaration of a reformation on a by now overtly flamboyant and corrupt Catholic Church. All contributing to this picture, not least backed up in the gathering new wave of literature that started flying around to depict a pretty dark time. Those bolstering the Reformation, determined not to miss a trick, got on with defaming the Catholic Church, and in turn the Catholic Church reclaiming its own literary interpretation of what was going on, depicting their own counter-Reformation as being an altogether much lighter picture. What is clear though, and is probably a more accurate description of the much maligned term, the Dark Middle Ages, is that there was a lessening of literary output. There were less writers and scholars, and a lot less creativity all round. The growing abundance of new trade which opened up along the Silk Route through Constantinople ran along the Adriatic coastal cities, culminating in Venice, the gateway to Northern Europe. Not sufficient having fallen empires, catastrophic intermittent plagues, and to top it off the rodent-transmitted Black Death in the 1300s. No surprise then this gave rise to a stop-start toll on life. So lack of manpower and all-round focus was probably not far from the truth. In France, Charlemagne's Carolingian era, during the 800s to 924 CE, was seen as a beacon of light, and creative output took an upturn. But not for want of trying. For most of the Mediterranean countries, things had indeed been tough. However, the idea that the Renaissance proper started at 5:5 on a Friday in Florence, and at similar convenient stages of time for others, was probably far more of a subjective thing than some would have you believe. Depending on your position in time, during the 1,000 or so years from the 6th century onwards, the further away from the early Middle Ages you were, the brighter things got. It is true the idea of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment flourished out of the dying embers of fallen empire, but what is generally thought, between that demise of the great classic Greek and Roman empires and this awakening, is that it was a graduated rejuvenation. And it was precisely a desire to look back in order to relinquish some of that past glory that spurred all this regurgitation of classical thinking, which in turn gave rise in part to the idea of the Middle Ages as being dark or a non-entity. What is true is it was the documentation of this rebirth phenomena that garnered the attention and therefore the label Renaissance. And from an economic point of view, the Renaissance did indeed start in Italy, and the crucial enabler of all this was Italy's location. It was the perfect melting pot for Enlightenment potential. Whether science, trade or art, Italy had it in bucket loads. That isn't to say that things weren't bubbling away elsewhere before the 12th century and in tandem throughout. In a nutshell, Italy's location in relation to the Silk Route brought the Enlightenment to Italy in the form of manufacturing skills. This to a country not governed by a sole ruling monarchy, so its provinces were also in direct competition with neighbouring principalities, creating an early form of capitalist commercialism. The idea of Florence being the epicentre was founded in a regional governing body stemming from a family of bankers, the Medicis, who, after reaching sufficient heights in money lending, eventually took it upon themselves to take over the principality, govern, and strike fear into the populace, even producing 3 popes. Cosimo de' Medici the Elder being the fire starter, but even that family had to pay tribute to the overarching power and influence of Rome. Christian religion having been the unifying base across Italy within the Latin-based Western Catholic Church of Rome. So, religious-driven capitalist endeavours began to forge within the Catholic Church. The Renaissance period became a vehicle for the transmission of art. As mentioned previously, this was documented in the lives of the artists, a hindsight piece of work undertaken by the anecdotal writer and also prolific painter Giorgio Vasari, who, giving the Renaissance profound written credibility in 1550 by declaring his favourite artists in this hitherto all-time Bible.